This is an Irreverent podcast. Check out irreverent.fm for shows from all our friends.
1 Corinthians warned you about the women with a loud mouth, and this podcast is just that. Here at the Speaking in Church podcast, we talk all about the regular people and the things that regularly happen to them in the evangelical church. It's a podcast about change, it's a podcast about seeking moral high ground, and it's a podcast for people who are just trying to deconstruct on the safe side. You can listen wherever you get your podcast, and if you want to be a guest, yes, you, regular person, you can be a guest on the Speaking in Church podcast. If you want to come on, just let us know.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Exvangelical, a show that explores the world inside and outside the evangelical subculture, one conversation at a time. I'm your host, Blake Chastain, and I'm bringing that tagline back. As I mentioned in a prior episode, I am doing a bit of experimentation with the podcast feed right now, doing different types of shows, different types of things with the release, and I'm really happy to share this conversation I had just last night with Gentry and Sarah Heath, who are co-hosts of a new show on IMG called Revcovery, which is all about pastors and other spiritual leaders leaving their positions and venturing out into the world beyond the pastoral profession. It's a really interesting conversation, and then we spend the second half talking about the Jerry Falwell Jr. piece that was published in Vanity Fair, as well as the piece that was published in Christianity Today by Russell Moore, and really trying to tease out what both of those pieces were trying to say about Jerry Falwell Jr.'s particular story. I'm really thankful for Justin and Sarah's insights into what it's like to first leave pastoral positions, and then second, their insights as former pastors on the way this very well-known Christian leader is being examined now after their downfall, so to speak. You can find a link to the Revcovery show in the show notes. That link will go to irreverent.fm, and you can also follow the show anywhere you listen to podcasts on whichever podcast platform or app that you prefer. This show, Exvangelical, is a production of the Post-Evangelical Post, which is my newsletter and my direct form of support. If you want to support my work, you can do so at $4, $6, or $8 a month and get ad-free podcast feeds as well as a few other benefits. You can find out more about that at postevangelicalpost.com. You can follow me on Twitter at brchastain and on Instagram and TikTok at brchastain_. If you have any comments for the show, you can email me at contact@exvangelicalpodcast.com, and you can also leave a message via a voicemail feature on exvangelicalpodcast.com. I am trying out a new sort of editing workflow that involves a new software that does things like removing filler words and some other stuff. So if you do notice anything in regards to the audio of this particular episode, please let me know, because this was an episode that we recorded just last night and I am releasing very quickly. All right, everybody, let's get into it. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to Exvangelical. I have with me this week the two hosts of the new IMG podcast, Revcovery, Justin Gentry and Sarah Heath. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks.
It's good to talk to both of you. Obviously, since we're all members of the IMG group, we've talked before, but I've actually not talked to Justin on air before. And Sarah, I have had you on a previous episode with another show that you do on the network. So very excited to talk to both of you about this new project that you've started. But before we do that, I'd love to, for the listener, just get a little bit of bio for both of you. Justin, let's start with you. Actually, we ended up going to the same college, but didn't really cross paths. But let's hear a little bit about your story, and let's tailor it a little bit towards what the topic of your podcast is, which is leaving pastoring as a profession.
Yeah. So I was a evangelical pastor for about 15 years. I initially got my schooling at the same school that Blake went to. And as I've said on our podcast, it's a unique job. And it's honestly, it's a very fun job at times. There are things about it that are, I think, very good, being there for the high points and low points of people's lives, being able to help people that may be underserved because the lack of finances or whatever, like having a church community can be a very good thing. Mm-hmm. But there's also a lot of pain and difficulty that comes with that, particularly in evangelical spaces. So as my faith began to evolve and to change and shift and become more inclusive, I learned very quickly that when you become a pastor, they expect you to not change at all. Once you sign on the dotted line and say, I'm an evangelical pastor, they just want you to don't change. You're not allowed to, change the script. And we're paying you to provide a service to us and provide a script to us and reassure us, I think. So as I began to change, it just became a point where I had to make a break from ministry. And it was, in my case, Sarah will share her story. In my case, it was very painful and tragic for me. It was I was immediately thrown into the corporate world. That transition from being a pastor where I essentially set my own hours. I worked very odd hours because I was a youth pastor actually at the time. Mm-hmm. And going immediately into 9 to 5, TPS reports, all that stuff. And it was very difficult for me. And so part of our podcast is naming that difficulty. I think ministry as a profession is very sticky in the sense that even if you want to leave, your ability to leave and not have to start completely from scratch it's very hard. So there's a big barrier to leaving. And then there's just a lot of language and stuff you just don't pick up. You feel like you're a child again in a lot of ways. So we want to make that process a little smoother. We want to name that being a pastor is a unique thing and also leaving is a unique thing. As much as we can build community around helping people do ministry well if they want to stay in, but also build a bridge to get out. It helps avoid some of the pitfalls that we ran into.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Sarah, what about you as far as your more recent exit from ministry as a full-time profession?
Yeah, so we actually was in a meeting of Irreverent Media where we started realizing that there are some unique things that happen when you leave ministry. And I had a different situation than Justin where I was able to craft the ending and I was trying to avoid harm, not just for myself, but also for the congregation I was serving. I knew that I was burnt out. I knew that my faith had shifted in ways that it made it really difficult to figure out how to be present to the people around me in a way that felt authentic. And if I wasn't anything, I was authentic in ministry. And I was lucky enough to serve a congregation, and I was a church restart. So I had restarted a community that had dwindled down to 17 to 27, and we grew quite quickly within 5 years, quickly for Methodism, because it has to be methodical. So we grew. But I myself was exhausted, and my faith hadn't shifted in a way that I didn't feel like I could be completely authentic, but I definitely felt drained spiritually, physically, and emotionally. And so we were talking about this and realized when the new person got announced for my community, there was such a moment of grief for me that doesn't make sense for people who have passed on a CEO position and when I was walking away, I knew that I couldn't stay and I wasn't sure where I was headed to next, but I knew that there would be implications that a lot of people wouldn't understand. And so we joked around, and as you two know about me, I love a pun. I should have dad jokes are like a weird spiritual gift of mine. And so when we came up with Revcovery, I was like, I think this is a thing. We named it, so now we got to claim it. So we talk a lot about it, and I think it fits nicely within a space where someone today actually I was having dinner with was like, hey, I listened to your podcast. I was like, you in no way are in ministry. Like, you're in the film industry. And he was like, yeah, I think I just love hearing two people who the way that it ended was so different, but the way that you guys are helping other people work through their own grief of vocational change, even for folks outside of ministry. He's like, I realized you started it with this very niche mindset. He said, but I think you're going to be surprised how much it hits people for beyond that. And then his other statement was like, it has me thinking about something I'd never thought about before, which is that when you left because he was part of our church community, him and his wife, And it affected us in a way that your doctor retiring doesn't affect you, or there's just this, what does this mean? And so we recognize all the nuances of it, and we're hoping to help people figure out, like, what the heck is LinkedIn? The joke Justin and I made is, like, when you've left a job where one of your job description was discipleship maker, like, you're either going to have to be a cult leader or like a tech startup leader, or you're going to have to, like, it doesn't make sense for people who don't play, like, World of Warcraft. There was like, there was just this, okay, we've got to help people become civilians. And I use that language obviously jokingly, but there is this weird, who am I now? And so we've gotten such a big response, Blake. It's been lovely and humbling. And like, my direct messages on Instagram are just full of people saying, A, they always start with, I've never reached out to anyone I don't know before. And then B, I didn't know I was even feeling half the things you guys described. So hopefully we can be partners in helping people journey so they don't do things like the person we're going to discuss did.
Yeah.
Because there's other ways to get out, and they're not great.
Yeah.
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 I want to circle back to a couple of things that both of you mentioned. You both use language like faith shifting, and as a pastor, as a spiritual leader, you are, even though evangelicalism in particular, and even whether, depending on who you talk to, I think Methodists are either considered evangelical or not. The fact that they're splitting over LGBTQ affirmation, I think, makes them evangelical.
Yeah, that's pretty evangelical right there.
Yeah, like having our own split, thinking anyone cares. People do care, obviously. Obviously, people care and care deeply and should. But more, I think this is an adventure in missing the point, friends.
But sorry for that aside. You both use this language of faith shifting, and even though evangelicals like to think of themselves as being a faith group that doesn't require some sort of person of authority between them and God, like it's understood in, say, Catholicism, there is still a symbolic sort of role that the head pastor, the lead pastor, takes on. And that symbol, as you mentioned, Justin, it's not supposed to change. It's supposed to be It's supposed to be like, you give this message, and it doesn't really matter how you feel. Given that even this historical moment we're in, the Great Resignation is also happening in the ranks of pastoral ranks and other clerical workers. How does that play out, this deep sense of calling that led you to follow this profession?
Yeah.
When that changes, and you're in a position of leadership where you're not expected to change your mind, what does that do for you internally?
I think it creates a false self. And I think sometimes you don't even know you're doing it. And even though I was lucky, and so I was 16 years in full-time ministry, and that's where you guys are supposed to say, oh my gosh, you don't look like it. But I was in 16 years of full-time ministry, 5 as a solo lead pastor, and before that I'd done 5 where I was a campus lead pastor. And so I didn't recognize how much my life would change once I left. Honestly, I was a lead youth and college pastor. And then the next thing I knew, I was a lead pastor of a campus. And I didn't realize how much, because I like to think of myself as not someone who's about titles, or like, the thing is, I don't make people call me by the right reverend, except for you guys. I don't use those like fancy titles, or I let people call me pastor when I am their pastor. They don't have to call me. That's not something I require, because I really wanted to be with the people. But what I didn't realize is the whole time I was trying to be with and of and amongst, I never recognized the pedestal I accidentally stood on. And that both had benefits that I wasn't aware of, but it also had a dehumanization that I wasn't ready for. And so part of that is, there were days when you recognize that the way you said hi to someone will be something that they will discuss for the rest of their day. Now, mind you, you might have just been in the midst of a really busy moment and not properly greeted, and then someone's going to say, well, Pastor Sarah's really full of herself today, or whatever it might be. And you start to notice those moments enough if you're an empathetic person, or if you're aware. So imagine if it's something big as I'm being tasked with being the keeper of the knowledge, and I'm not sure that this knowledge is exactly what is both correct, quote unquote, right? Or is helpful. And so you've got this message within a person of faith that you're trying to share with people, this good news, and it doesn't feel really good sometimes. And it also, there are moments when you're like, I'm working this stuff out and I need to be human in it. I need to be honest in it. I need to figure out. And so you can find yourself unintentionally faking it because you can't, it would be, I haven't never done it, even though I'm all about authenticity. I've never stood on a stage and been like, yeah, I'm not really sure what any of this is, if not a multi-level marketing thing. Like, I think, and I mean, and that's not true in every moment, but people both want you to be authentic and want you to be the authentic thing they need you to be. So that's not necessarily yourself. And if you throw in that, I think a lot of us that serve in ministry, we are, if you use the Enneagram language, we're Enneagram 3s or we're 5s or we're people who know how to put on a different persona, to code switch, to be like something, and we don't mean to do it, but we know that your ability to feel comfortable in a space makes it necessary for me maybe to put my own feelings or even my own spirituality on the back burner and act like we're all in this together when maybe I'm not.
Yeah. There were many times I felt caught between what I'm feeling and what I feel like maybe I need to express, or maybe this is what, if you want to use more kind of evangelical language, what God has put on my heart versus what they expect me to say. And what and then not even what they expect me to say, because that almost puts a nefarious twist on it. Like what they need me to say. What do they need from me in this moment? When someone loses a loved one and they come to me and say, I'm worried they're not in heaven. At times, my most authentic response would be like, yeah, I don't know.
Is there a heaven?
But you get caught in that moment of, okay, I really have to put myself to the side here and be a professional religious person, professional Christian. We just recorded an episode about that. I'm not sure when it'll debut, but it'll be coming soon. And when can I be authentic? And I think for a lot of pastors, you really start to lose sight as to which is the mask and which is reality. And I'm not even going to say the mask is bad at all times, because sometimes that's just the professional role you're in. You need to do that. But because it's spirituality and it is so personal, you lose sight of who you are. My experience of leaving, I thought when I left, I was sensing that I'm following Jesus out the door, was the way I left. But once I was out and I didn't have to uphold the brand, I didn't have to believe on behalf of other people anymore, a lot of things very quickly started to fall away. Because then I started to get in touch with who I actually was. And I never would have experienced that had I not walked away, and so I'm grateful for that. But it was also a very jarring experience to be like, wow, I was really putting on a face here and I had no idea. I don't think I ever lied in the sense of I actively deceived, unlike the person we're going to talk about today. I don't feel it was ever an active deception. But it's subtle. Yeah, you code switch, you realize this is the role I'm in. And then before long, you really lose yourself if you're not very careful and very intentional about not doing that.
For me, there were also pieces where that was not only the messaging I was getting from the pews, but that was the messaging I was getting from bosses and mentors. I went through a very difficult time early on in my ministry as a lead. And now put in that, I'm a lead female who looks young. So I'm a lead female who looks young, who is actually, at the time I was younger, a lead female who looks young. And I was brought in and I was about 30 years old and I was getting married. And so that's a great story. We love that story, don't we? And then he left and it was a difficult time. And I was trying my best, we're talking would cry all the way down to the church and then have to go to a pharmacy to put makeup on because I'd cried it all off. And I would have to then go in and give these people some good news. And the reality was I was doing a pretty good job of it. But I got called in by one of my mentors who said, hey, people know you're sad. So nobody wants to follow a sad leader. So if you can figure out ways to cover that up a little bit more, that would be great, kind of thing. So if you're hearing patriarchy, correct, people know that you're overfeeling whatever it might be. I already was amped for that messaging. I was ready to hear, you got to suck it up, kid. because I was in so much grief that I was just trying to wade my way. And this person was kind and had what they hoped was my success in mind. But the messaging I heard was who you are doesn't matter. What you're going through doesn't matter. And so I learned to be performative in a way that I think was needed, because had I got on stage and just said, my boyfriend broke up, that would not have been helpful. And perhaps maybe it would, but it would not have been helpful. And I always say you don't preach from, and I think I heard this from like a Rob Bell thing, and I probably heard it somewhere else as well. Like, you never preach from your scabs, you preach from your scars. And I think that's great and wonderful, but it's hard to do that in real time. And yeah, there's just, the other thing I would say that I think is something that I've realized over the last couple of years, and I think this is important because, again, it's going to go in. We're doing the giantest lead-in into this conversation. But I was thinking about this is there aren't many professions where your friends have an opinion about how you do it. So as an example, my friend that I was having dinner with tonight, I assume that he is the best in his industry. I just assume because he's my friend, right? I assume that my friends are really good lawyers, doctors, whatever they might be, nurses, I assume. There were not many spaces I was going into where people didn't have an opinion about how I did my job. And that opinion was based on how I performed the week before. So imagine if you're constantly going in to a situation where not only are people within your organization like deciding whether or not they're going to show up the next week. So imagine if your like office presentation you have to give, like the whole office is, are we coming in on Monday? Let's hear what she has to say. You know what I mean? Like, that's a reality.
Yeah.
So of course you create these two images of yourself. Now you're going into, you got into this because you had this really deep feeling that this is what the divine had set out for you. And when that goes sideways, not only does that affect your own spirituality, but did I read the signs wrong? What was it? And so I think I just want to be really careful for people to hear. We're not saying that we intentionally created two people, or even that in the moment, if you are doing this right now, that you are two people. And I feel like I was really given, because I never acted like that again after that. After I left that position, I worked for other people and it was a different situation. And I just said, I can't show up as anything other than myself. And I have to admit, I had a wonderful congregation that I served last, that I did try to show up really authentically, but that led to me leaving because showing up authentically meant for me to say, I can't be here anymore.
Everything that both of you are describing sounds like reasonable sort of defense mechanisms or coping mechanisms to the sort of situation that pastors find themselves in. As you mentioned, Sarah, like since you're being judged on your performance based on small interactions, or when you think about it, pastors are very much like the original content creators. Like you have a content calendar that follows
how many likes.
Yep, you've got to have your content posted and ready every week to preach or teach or whatever it might be, and people are going to respond to that. They might.
You're basically saying the same thing over and over again in different ways.
Yeah,
yeah, and people will take it how they take it. I remember I did a sermon and I felt like it was really good. And there was a guy that came up afterwards and he said, I really liked how you talked about how God is with us in our struggles. And that's a fine sentiment, but not once in that entire sermon did I talk about how God was with us in our struggles. So it was like he got something out of it, so that's a win.
I would have been a fly on the wall for that just reaction.
But it was just like, and I'm even like filtering in the back of my head, because sometimes I do go off script in a sermon, but I'm like, nope, I didn't say nope. Oh, I'm so glad you enjoyed it. So yeah, you don't know you have no idea what it is going to be received. And just like Sarah said, you may make an offhanded comment that is completely misinterpreted, and then those people are gone out of your life for good.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you awkwardly see him in a restaurant with more people from the church and you're like, hi. And there's like an awkward hi. Like literally, I joke that working in church ministry is seeing ex-boyfriends constantly. That's that feeling you feel. Well, you guys are heterosexual males, but when you see that girlfriend that you didn't work out with, but like you never really closed it off. And so then you see them in a restaurant or whatever, and you're like, how are you? You look good. That's what it feels like whenever you run into people who no longer go to your church for something that you have no idea about. So you're just like, hey, how's it been? I've meant to call.
You always feel like you're catching people. Like even people that go to your church, like whenever you say hi to them, like they feel like they've been caught.
Oh, we both go to McDonald's sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, me too. Yeah, you just feel like you're catching people all the time.
And it's really encouraging that that this is, you guys are having this both. You both are having these conversations in public and adding it to the other sorts of conversations that are taking place around things like phase shifts, all the things this whole constellation of related topics like deconstruction and whatever else, that this particular conversation is taking place because the pastors and other church leaders are just as susceptible to the same sort of struggles and doubts as anybody else. But as you've both detailed so well, there's a lot more consequence to it because it's tied to your livelihood and your sense of calling.
And I'll say this because I think this is important as two people who I think have tried really hard to be able to be in the deconstructionist space, if you will, whatever we're calling it, the ex-evangelical space, in ways that are helpful and not harmful. And so when you do that, oftentimes people are very open around you. The other thing that I think happens is that a lot of people are very angry and have every right to be very angry with the pastors that hurt them or harm them and the systems that hurt them and harm them. But I think they also have to understand is this huge movement is happening. There are a bunch of well-intentioned people who are going through the same thing as you and are hearing that they're terrible, not only from the people they used to be the pastor for, the bosses and things like that. They're also hearing it from the people that are going through the same thing as them. So what we really wanted to do is make a space that isn't in any way saying, I understand that you might hear people go, what are you whining about? Life is getting to make your own schedule. I think it's sometimes that when we are in pain, we don't always recognize that other people are in pain. The reason I say that is there's so many forums or stuff that I'll just see people talk about pastors are this or pastors are that. And it's like this moment where we're like, but not all are. And it's not appropriate for us to all say, but not all are. But we're hoping to like create a little bit of a Revcovery room, if you will, for people to be able to say, man, when so many people came out with that thing about pastors, and I know maybe they weren't talking about me, but it hit and it hurt because I tried really hard. I think that's another reason that we've done it, recognizing that you can't always talk about your pain within deconstructionist spaces and be allowed to have that pain.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, that sort of segues into what the last question that I have before we shift topics to talk about something else, which is how, when it comes to your own relationships, how these things change. You've talked about the stresses that being a person of spiritual authority, whether you were able to perceive it or not at the time, in your roles as pastors, limited the way that you could be present or express yourself. How have you both experienced what it's like on the other side of that? Like
the other side of the stained glass window is what we say. I don't know why we came up with that saying one day, and we've just rolled with it.
Yeah,
I don't know what's wrong with me. Why do I have to brand everything?
Yeah, we're both pretty bad at dad jokes and branding, and also like
this is why we're friends, though.
We both have over a decade of experience of doing 3 points in a poem for everything, and an acronym, and people eating it up. That's the thing. I see a 3-point sermon that's like a PR or 4-point sermon, PRAY or whatever, and I laugh at it now, but I also go, oh yeah, that was pretty good work.
Can I, before I answer your question, tell you guys my worst and yet best one?
Please do.
Yes, absolutely.
I wanted to do the most creative, and I always do weird things at Christmas. So I want to do this very creative worship series about, and this is going to be like very trauma activating for some people, all the worship series.
Brace yourselves.
I was going to do a worship series. It's as bad as my deconstructionist joke that I told on TikTok. I wanted to do a worship series about the cool nature of Jesus's family tree. That's the people that are included in Jesus's family tree is scandalous, and it doesn't make sense other than to point out that this person of Jesus, however you feel about that right now, had these scandalous people. And it tells the story of women. And so I was like, we're going to talk about, you guys are going to be so disappointed. We're going to talk about Jesus's ancestry. I named the series 23 and He.
Yes.
And this is why we can't have nice things.
Nice. I bet you got compliments, though. I bet people thought that was really clever.
My artist did like the thing that like the 23 and Me, like the bulletin looked like that logo, guys.
Nice.
And now I'll see like
That's very good.
Local church doing like a world transformer thing using the transformer. I'm like, bah. They don't know. They know that's so dumb. But 23 and He had me real proud.
And look at you now. Now you're a sinfluencer.
Now I'm a
sinfluencer.
Yeah, I would say on the other side, it's interesting because I still work within church spaces. What I'm doing currently is I coach folks one-on-one, doing usually around their vocation, oftentimes as pastors that are either transitioning in their work or are actually exiting out. And so I'm still in that. And I also consult churches around making space, both literally and figuratively, for themselves and making space for people. The communities that I've served have been very diverse and LGBTQIA inclusive and affirming. And so I'm still in those spaces in some way. So I feel like I'm not totally out, but I can tell you not being a lead pastor feels very freeing. And it's hard because I feel guilty for it. And I know I'm only 6 months out. Justin and I we realize sometimes when we're talking about people that we're going to interview, we're like, how many years did they serve? How long have they been out? And we totally sound like we're a prison podcast. And maybe we are.
Which is a telling metaphor.
All the metaphors we use are like veterans, prisoners,
You've seen some shit.
You have definitely seen some shit.
There is some trauma here.
Sarah's created some shit. But I think there is something to be said. Justin spoke about it earlier. This like freedom to actually try to figure out what I want and who I am a little bit, not a little bit, but very disconnected from, and that a community, and that has both blessing and curse. So what would you say?
That very well may have been what drew you to spiritual things to begin with, right? Is that the exploration, but then you have to lead, and that isn't necessarily the same thing.
Oftentimes I think about that. There's a scene from a Monty Python movie that I used to watch them with my grandpa, and I think it's The Life of Brian, the guy who's confused for Jesus. And there's this moment where he's running away, and this guy is confused for Jesus. And so he's like, I am not the Savior. And he's running away, and they're like, only the Savior would say he wasn't the Savior. And then he's like, fine, I'm the Savior. Like, he's admitting he's the Savior. Yeah. And I think the neat thing I've found is more and more when I say, I'm not sure, but I'd love to question with you, and I'd love to walk with you. And I have been given this really blessing in a weird way, and I hate to use the word blessing, but I've been given this like gift of being able to spend time really academically researching the thing that a lot of us just, don't have the time to do. And I spent solid years at a solid academic institution studying this stuff. And so when I question it, there are some differences or maybe some nuances I can suggest to you, or some cultural background or whatever it might be. And I still like to play in those playgrounds, but it's nice now to not be worried that what I say will affect this person's attachment to a community.
Justin, what about you?
Could you repeat the question? We had a few digressions.
Sure. We did. And that's and
totally it's okay. Fine. I just was like, I want to answer the question. So looping back to the original prompt, and all the digressions were great. I totally tracked. I am fine with them.
The original prompt was really just about how you feel about relationships that you can have and that sort of thing. And one of the things that motivated that question is I knew someone who was a pastor who I knew through someone who was like a religion PhD, friend of a friend that I became friends with as well. And he had a hard and fast rule, this pastor, of if you came to his church, you couldn't be his friend, like his personal friend. Mm-hmm. That was his own personal rule, was that I'm not going to have that type of relationship with a parishioner. And that was just his own way of managing things personally. And I know that is a concern for some pastors. So how have you been able to navigate or change the way you have relationships with other people, or even those in the closer spheres of your life?
It's for me, there's a lot of levels to that because even when I left, there were still people that saw me as a spiritual authority. Like I was still their pastor, at least in their heads.
Yeah.
And I still, I think, held on to that responsibility in a lot of ways. And while I enjoyed the freedom to experiment privately and play in the playground, like Sarah said, it is a real gift to have the level of theological training we have and to be able to play at the level we're able to play at. And it's once you leave ministry, like kind of the training wheels are off. And it's, I have the freedom to really dive into this. And this is what interested me. So I feel like that's very good. But you also realize that there are still people that think of me as an evangelical pastor. When I post something online or when I, do a podcast or something and they happen to hear about it, like it's my relationships are still breaking in some ways, even 5 years later, because there are people that haven't caught up with me, and then they'll catch an episode of, my other podcast that I do with Tori Williams Douglas, Go Home Bible, You're Drunk, which is therapeutic for us. Yeah. But I think it's a rude awakening in some ways for people that I am not who they thought I was. And I've got a lot more confident about that and a lot less, I think that mask has really fallen away from me, but I'm still very aware, I think, of some people that I still have a pastoral responsibility to. It looks very different. But
I think that's an important thing to say because, Justin, one of the things you and I have been most shocked about, so we recorded, we've got a lot of things in the bank, but that we still worry. So when the episode came out this week that was about Justin, the vulnerability hangover both of us had, our first episode when we just said that we were going to talk about these things. And then his episode coming out, in a way, he said, in a weird way, it feels like I'm obviously not the drama of coming out, but it felt like you were coming out or being more open, even though you haven't been in that role for 5 years. And I wonder how many things there are in this world that have that sort of ghost residual. I still worry what people think.
And there are people that had very significant moments with me in their life that is still connected to Jesus and Christianity and things like that. And I am still hesitant to break that for them in some ways. And to be like, I was doubting the whole time. And then the question comes up for them, like, was Justin lying when he said that to me? Did he really believe that? Is this all fake? And so I feel like I don't want to go around making breaking points for people. Some people need to be broken probably, but there are some people and relationships that I still cherish in some ways. And it is a weird thread. I think that's probably why a lot of pastors, when they leave ministry, they just go radio silence and they have no more public life. And so I think stepping into a different kind of public work or kind of an adjacent public work it's a unique experience, at least for me. It's not something that I expected. And I enjoy it, certainly. And I welcome the challenge and the kind of personal growth that comes from that and the conversations too, because I've had a lot of very positive feedback from people that are pastors currently and former students and former people that were under my care pastorally when I was pastoring adults. So I've had good feedback, but there's still that like cringe. Yeah. Is that one board member going to call me? Like, even though I don't care what they think, I would probably hang up on them if they did call me, but there's still that like, I don't know, residual trauma or like that ghost of a feeling of I'm still in. It's almost like a dream. Like I wake up and I'm still a pastor. No,
right.
But it's it's a curious thing, I think.
I think it was like Henry. I never know how to say his name out loud. Henry Nouwen.
Henry Nouwen.
Yeah.
He wrote the book The Wounded Healer, which is about that, of being a person that has your own wounds, but is supposed to be a healer of some sort. And to your point, Justin, I think it's got to be a very difficult position to be in where you change to the degree that you're now the person that's out of bounds, so to speak, maybe to someone else's eyes from this like beloved community or whatever they have in their mind of what the invisible church is or what have you. That's a significant thing, and that's not a light thing. And it's brave, good work to be able to put those things out there.
And we'll just keep having vulnerability hangovers where we call each other in the morning. Did I say the thing? Because there's like a list of people you want to call and say, not you, not you.
I
Yeah.
I may
wasn't
have said
talking
that the
about
church
you.
made me feel this way, but it wasn't, because
Yeah.
there are
Yeah.
so many relationships or significant moments that you don't want to take from people, because we've all had that moment when someone that really mattered to us, again, in the conversation we're about to have, someone that really mattered to a bunch of people. And when there's a downfall or where they change their opinion about something, you're left in the wake going, was any of it real?
Yeah. Yeah, because even though that sentiment that even if though something's temporary doesn't mean it's not real or significant. That like the significance of the sort of blessed assurance that a lot of people associate with faith is one of the more significant things, and it is a hard thing to lose or to recognize when someone else's relationship to that changes that you are in a relationship with. It's a very sort of tender type of work, but I think you have identified a conversation that wasn't really happening in this sort of accessible way and are meeting that need, which is great. So,
Oh, thank you.
1 Corinthians warned you about the women with a loud mouth, and this podcast is just that. Here at the Speaking in Church podcast, we talk all about the regular people and the things that regularly happen to them in the evangelical church. It's a podcast about change, it's a podcast about seeking moral high ground, and it's a podcast for people who are just trying to deconstruct on the safe side. You can listen wherever you get your podcast, and if you want to be a guest, yes, you, regular person, you can be a guest on the Speaking in Church podcast. If you want to come on, just let us know.
So a hard pivot here to a related topic-ish, I'd say. Really, it's about how a recent story that is in the news relates to how leaders are judged, which was something that you talked about earlier, Sarah, about the sort of judgments that people pass on those. And what I'm talking about is this recent profile that happened in Vanity Fair about Jerry Falwell Jr. And then and also this sort of subsequent story that was published, an article that was published in response to it by Russell Moore in Christianity Today. To sum up the Vanity Fair article, it really is this profile of Jerry Falwell, who, depending on whose story you believe, was either in a non-monogamous relationship along with his wife and another man, or that it was an affair on the part of his wife. And the scandal around that led to him being ousted, and some other things that he did led to him being ousted as the president of Liberty University, which has an infamous student social policy called the Liberty Way, which is a very stringent policy on their behavior. And he did not live up to this Liberty Way.
Yeah. And you get fined money for not following it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And he says in the article, one of the pull quotes is, "Because of my last name, people think I'm a religious person, but I'm not. My goal was to make them realize I was not my dad." I want to start actually there before even...
There's like a therapy doctorate that could be right in that statement there.
Not my dad!
Yeah.
You're not my real dad.
Yeah, wow.
So let's start with what we learn from this article. And it's a long article. It goes into a lot of detail about Jerry Falwell and his wife Becky and all this other stuff. Just within the context of that, what is your read on the way that Falwell Jr. is trying to position himself as a participant in, but not a believer of, this type of evangelical Christianity, and whether it matters, given his role and the power that he has?
Whether it matters.
Yeah, like I am of so many different minds. I think my initial take is almost, I don't believe you. Like when he says, it gives the air of I was never religious. I didn't really care. He even talks about how people would say, dovetail into the Russell Moore article about he was a hypocrite because he drank, even though the Liberty Way is that you can't drink.
Mhm.
And he says, there's nothing that says the president has to hold to the Liberty Way. And so it seems
I
to me
never
almost
signed the document.
yeah, I never signed that I wasn't going to drink.
It
You guys
reminds me.
thought you guys thought I wasn't going to drink? Yeah.
It reminds me of the guy that this opportunistic app developer who jumped on the Wordle craze and created a scammy iOS app that charged like $30 a week or something.
Yeah. And I don't know the man, but some of it felt like I am backfilling the story to make me look better, or even subconsciously. I talked about this on Go Home Bobby You're Drunk a little bit. Like, I think sometimes when you have a big break in life, not just faith, but you retroactively can say, I didn't really ever believe that, or I didn't really want to do that. And sometimes that can be therapeutic. And I don't know if he's doing that, but it just read as like, how do you not believe this? And if you didn't believe this, that's genuinely true, you are a deeply pathological person. Like, almost like you are saying this in a way that because you think this makes you look better, but it actually makes you look so much more skeezy and scammy. And yeah, that was it. There's also this undercurrent too of almost sympathy for him, in the sense of he had that last name and there were so many assumptions made about who he was that he just fell into it. And I'm not saying he's have good character or someone who deserves sympathy, but I have sympathy for that journey of having expectations placed on you. And then once you get them, you realize you didn't want them, and now you don't know what to do with them. I can have sympathy for that aspect of it.
I think there can be sympathy and accountability.
Yes. Yeah. I have to go hand in hand.
And if you really didn't like it, bro, you shouldn't have taken the job. You're a lawyer. You could have worked somewhere else.
And that is one point that's brought up, is that he wasn't in any capacity holding a clergy oriented position. But the thing we all know from experience of living in evangelical institutions is that they can often have ecclesial overtones. It carries with it like a religious authority. And he also had actionable political power. And to me, that is also, to me, complicates the sort of narrative that he's pushing in this, is that
me too, guys.
He used that to the fullest extent. He was an early backer of Trump in the evangelical circles. The only person that predated him was Robert Jeffress. And so he clearly knew what he was doing. And the ways in which he talks about not being religious, and even he talks about his dad wanting to impress his wife. Jerry Sr. wanting to impress his wife by appearing conservative. But he wasn't really like that because he was friends with Larry Flint.
And he was drinking all of our NyQuil. That was the weirdest moment of my dad's a cool dad. He's not like other dads. He was drinking NyQuil.
And to put all the blame on a deceased woman who cannot defend herself
literally, that's that is 100% a lawyer move. I'm actually a little bit proud of him I know who I'll blame: the dead person, dead woman.
Blame my dead mother for my
dead father.
And also, he has this air of, I didn't really believe it, or I'm not religious. But then the Vanity Fair article talks about, this is December 2015. He says, in my opinion, Donald Trump lives a life of loving and helping others as Jesus taught. And when evangelicals were saying,
in his defense, it could have he meant Jesus. We assumed.
There were a few Jesuses in this story.
We assume he meant Jesus the Christ.
So
he could have meant.
He's acting in religious authority and using religious language to get what he wants. For him to say, I wasn't religious, well, you very much used religion when it suited you. And when it got you favors, or I should say, when you were returning a favor to Michael Cohen.
To Michael Cohen, yes.
Yeah. So it did reek of quid pro quo, and I'll help you if you help me. And of course, they deny all of that. But
there's just some massive undertones of toxic masculinity of because you're in the room, you're the authority. Because your last name is a certain name, you're. And I just want to say, it reminds me of, and you're not going to be shocked, it reminds me of Britney Spears. No, I'm just kidding. There was a moment in Britney Spears' career early on where she was getting a lot of what I would say unfair critique because I think she was the first since Madonna person who was a little more sexualized. And if you have listened to any podcast about her past, she wasn't the one who chose that as an identity. That was marketing people who decided she needed to be an innocent bad girl because that was what was going to sell. So she had a moment of clarity where she said in an interview, and I'll never forget this, I never wanted to be a role model. And I remember thinking, but you still take the paycheck. Now we realize this thing that we do, we have to be really, it's interesting because like we demand something of our people in a spotlight. And we were just talking for 45 minutes about how that can be really harmful to the person who's in the spotlight. But I think the difference is to recognize people who are willing to admit that they are in the spotlight. And I think he took all this and what that means. I don't want to be a role model. Then don't take the job at a Christian institution where you're literally telling kids that you're teaching them how to be role models. If you read through all the language, there's a great podcast on all of this called Gangster Capitalism that is a little less of a kind read of Jerry Falwell Jr. Because I think the Vanity Fair article did bring about empathy in me a little bit. But I also think it ran over all those people that were incredibly harmed. I know students from the LGBTQIA community who were incredibly harmed during the Jerry Falwell years and continue to have a lot of pain around this. And so I think it's, oh, guys, I didn't mean to because I was being honest about who I am. No, you weren't. If you didn't think it was wrong, then why were you covering it up? Why did you say you were holding a glass of Coke? Why did you, like... If it really was something that you were proud of or didn't see as contrary to the person you were projecting, then why did you spend so much time lying about it?
And even the Russell Moore article like goes on this apology tour for Jerry Falwell Jr. Oh, he always told us who he was. Like, no, he did not. Like, he did near the end, near the very end when he was, I think, trying to consciously or not torpedo his career. Like, sure, yeah, he did start showing you who he was. But for all those years when he was from 2007 to really 2000, maybe 18, 19, he was hot stuff and no one really questioned it. And so, yeah, he wasn't being a hypocrite because he was always bad. Right. It's just why are you putting this word salad into the world?
Yeah. The very narrow definition that Russell Moore posits is it's not any sort of way in which I've seen the word hypocrite used.
Yeah.
He says he means it only in one sense. Russell Moore writes, when I say that Jerry Falwell is no hypocrite in only one sense, obviously he was hypocritical and among other things, allegedly engaging in behavior that blah, blah, blah would have led to fines or expulsions for his students. But then he goes on and talks about for Jesus, the congruence between the inner and the outer, the heart and the mouth, the motivations and the behavior, the public and the private, is a crucial matter of integrity before God. The warnings were needed, Jesus told us, because hypocrisy is by definition crafty and hidden. He was doing crafty and hidden things. He wasn't doing things out in the open.
No one can see this, but your face is priceless right now. You're like, I'm very confused and angry at the same time.
I'm just befuddled by even why.
Yeah,
like literally, I almost launched into an old school word study when I saw this.
I might have.
I pulled up. I was like hypocrisy word study. I just Googled that, and it was like a very evangelical website. But I went through it. And
I made it through.
But I'm totally confused by what the point of this article was.
I think it was to point out that we made a king out of him. That was the point. Yeah. Was to say, you can be shocked about Falwell. What I'm hoping, this is my nice read of it. What I'm hoping is that it says, let's not do the thing we do quite often, whereas we that person is bad, and we don't recognize the system that let that person get there. I'm hoping, because it sounded like it was, who's a hypocrite? We are, because when you point one way, you've got all the fingers pointing back.
Yeah,
Whatever.
what you just described, Sarah, is a really good article, and I wish that article would
Generous
have been
read.
that.
It was such a generous read.
Yeah, because I do think that's a good point. Like if Russell Moore is trying to make that point, and if it is, it's really buried in there, that there are some systemic problems that enabled Jerry Falwell to be the way he was, and we did hero worship him. We talk about toxic masculinity or patriarchy, and typically we're talking about people like Jerry Falwell. But I also think there's kind of a patriarchy from the bottom up, where people need a savior and need a leader or feel the need for a ruler, and so they put that on somebody. And so I do think that's a good discussion to have, and pastors feel that, certainly, whether you want to be on a pedestal or not, you are. And Jerry Falwell Jr., sorry bud, when you're the chancellor of the premier evangelical university, you're put on a pedestal, and you can use that or not. And there will be people that will cover for you without even consciously knowing it, because they want to protect their faith, their belief in this system. And so they will they're covered for him for years. And it wasn't until he's posting on Instagram in ways that they can't cover for him anymore. And now it's like, okay, we have to do something now. It's a breaking for us now.
There's such a strange, thing that's happening too in both articles, which is they make Becky, who is Falwell's wife, into this very caricature of a woman who's been ignored and then goes and does a thing to get attention. And it's a very strange read. And in the end, I don't know if you guys read this, but I mean, I know you read the article, but probably didn't hit you the way it hit me. I'm actually speaking to a group of clergy and predominantly males, predominantly conservative-ish community, to talk about why, when we talk about the flesh and the mind is separate, so our flesh is bad, our mind is good, right? Like that sort of Gnostic, if you will, but like that dichotomy, creating that dualism, and talking about flesh is bad is what led to an eating or disordered issue I had with eating. As I read this Vanity Fair article, they at the end of it are like, she said she's battled depression and gained a significant amount of weight. Like, it was this very why are we talking about that?
Weight was mentioned a couple times because her weight, but also his weight too, because he talked about when the affair came out, he wanted to lose weight and wanted to get in shape and was taking testosterone supplements, and that's why he was so combative during that season of time. Yeah, I did feel like she got thrown under the bus and characterized in a very one-dimensional way.
It's a very strange. Both articles are very strange. It's almost like I want to sit down with them and say, what was your intention of writing this? What were you trying to, for the Vanity Fair article, were you trying to humanize someone that's been dehumanized?
And you should highlight Becky.
You're right. Or highlight the pool boy, who literally, if we call him the pool boy one more time, it's a man.
He is Juan Carlo.
Yeah, it's a strange, it is a very strange conversation. And I think you guys caught me. I was hoping that the article was trying to have us look at our own ability to listen to someone that doesn't have the credentials to be listened to. And I don't mean credentials like academic credentials. I mean, nothing in Jerry Falwell Jr.'s past, other than the fact that he had that name and that meant something to that group of people, should have meant that he became the chancellor of a university.
Yeah, he helped turn it around financially by means I don't know whether even those are ethical, because of the ways in which there's been some reporting about the ways in which Liberty runs their online college.
Yeah, that's what gangster capitalism is about.
Yeah.
So even from that aspect, there's a question of what if we're using a moral standard. And that's what I think is the most confusing thing to me, is what the standards are that, was the Vanity Fair article about, to your point, Sarah, humanizing someone and giving them a chance to tell their side of a story after being this person that is now persona non grata. There would have been an evangelical path toward redemption if the sex scandal didn't have the details it did. Like the details, because there's conflicting stories about whether everybody was willing participants, like all of these salacious things that make him not able to ingratiate himself back into that system. But then at the same time, I'm just not sure what the point of the Moore article was and what sort of moral standard Russell Moore is trying to posit, either for Jerry Falwell Jr. to be judged against or measured against, or the people that are in the pews. And what it comes down to is, like, Falwell Jr. says he's not a religious person, which, sure, that's fine. People are non-religious. I'm fine with that. But Moore says to him, meaning Falwell Jr., Trump was moral because he had created jobs and made payroll. Unlike some other Trump evangelical supporters with whom I disagreed, but whose positions were reasonable and understandable, Falwell didn't try to measure the business leaders, blah, 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 with some other objective, like judicial nominations. Instead, he often mimicked such attacks right along with the cartoonish and bullying tone of them. To me, the moral that I get from both these stories together is that Donald Trump is Jerry Falwell Jr.'s true Lord and Savior because he saved him from having to pretend to be a good person.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh, that's the quote right there. And that's the thing that the faces I'm making are because I am sick and tired of he's just a bad boy and boys will be boys.
Yep.
And that's what I felt was the underlying. That's the thing I get so sick about Trump supporters saying. Either you're an evangelical Christian who believes that there are these moral right things, or you think that Trump is okay. Because if you say that this is how you want someone to behave, and then this person behaves in this way, it's confusing as hell for the rest of us to figure out what is your litmus test. Mm-hmm. Because if someone like Jerry Falwell Jr. and who openly mocks people, and that's before he was honest about his daddy issues, or someone like Trump who shows very few of the markers of the way of Jesus, if that is your marker, and then we just say boys will be boys, they're just like, you're just being a bad boy. He's just being a bad boy, and it's like that. What is happening? That's the confusing part for me that I don't understand. Like, you're fundamentalist, but only about certain things. Like, it's very confusing. But then your students have to behave in a certain way. And then this whole little thing where Jerry Falwell's, I don't know. The other thing he was like, I love Jesus. I just don't love the church. And I think the reason a lot of people don't want to become Christians is because of the way that institutions and church are. You ran an effing institution, you giant asshat.
What about yourself?
Like, I don't understand what the hell you're doing.
Yeah, if only I had the power and finances to make real change in this world.
Instead, I'll find a pool boy. Like, it's the most confusing thing. That is like, how did we get here? On what planet? What is the face of the person interviewing him?
Yeah, that was the most unhinged statement I think I had read, and that whole article was like...
where was the follow-up question? Like that?
Yeah, excuse me. Can you respond to running an institution? I don't know what to do. Or did they just leave the farm at the end of the story because they're like, this is crazy town, and I'm going to take this exercise bike that's left in the hallway that somehow made it into the article and ride my way into the sunset.
They were really focused on that exercise bike.
That took half a paragraph, friends.
And I think it, and honestly, maybe the person that wrote the article had a word count to hit, and they didn't have good material from the Falwells. And there was a deadline, and they just had to let's just talk about the exercise bike.
Maybe there was so much crazy.
They're just like us. Those rich, disgraced evangelicals are just like us. They have to move old exercise equipment around too.
I think I get the article again that was written for Christianity Today. It also let Jerry Falwell Jr. off. Mm-hmm. It's not his fault. It's our fault. Look what we made Daddy do. And it just continues the cycle And I get nervous about, and I think even in the article, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but I read it a couple times, but I feel like there was just this sense he's a human just like the rest of us. But we put him on a platform. He put himself on that platform, I would argue, and then decided that he was going to pick a president. So if we could just say he just messed up a little Christian college and you could say Christian, the kids that were getting in there knew what they were getting into in some ways, that would be one thing. But if you have done any reading about, he knew what he was doing when he backed Trump. Yeah. Because he screwed with Ted Cruz about backing him for a long time and was like, hey, I might back you. What are you going to offer me? Like the weirdest. No Christian university leader should have the power to be a kingmaker. That's just a weird, it like literally is biblically wrong. Like the Bible talks about this. And let me just let you know, you're not the hero, dude. And I find this just very fascinating that we continue the narrative of this idea that let's not, go get therapy. That's fair. It is fair to say that he's a human that has gone through a lot. But at what point can we say, geez, we need to own up to something needs to be done about the fact that somebody knew along the way, but he was making the money, so they didn't do anything about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think, too, you say, like, you can't be a kingmaker because the Bible teaches against that, and I totally agree. But...
Well, I didn't mean to say that. I was just saying more the, like, a whole idea of no person should be the kingmaker.
Yeah, no person should be, and we live in a country where there's supposed to be a separation of church and state, but his dad was saying, and this is in the article too, like the idea that religion and politics don't mix was invented by the devil to prevent Christians from running their own country. So that's what he grew up with, and I think that is very much the mindset of the Jerry Falwell Christian, for lack of a better term. And for him to be the one that picks the president, I think they view that almost as Samuel anointing David. This is the holy man anointing our next president.
Yes.
And this is right and good as God intended, because they feel like we should have a Christian nation.
The chair of the history department at our college that I was a history major taught that the ideal form of government is theocracy, direct theocracy. So that's not. I'm sorry. I did have to interject that one thing. Yeah. I'm sorry, Justin. Continue.
Yeah. So this is the mindset that we're dealing with. So I do think that Jerry Falwell can say I was acting in my role as a religious leader in trying to anoint the king.
And then I would say, Jerry, I thought you said you weren't a religious leader.
Exactly. Like that's the thing where it's on the one side, he can defend his religious actions. And on the other side, I'm not a religious person. And so you're left with not knowing really who this person is, which is fine.
I don't think they
might not. They might genuinely not.
And I see that same equivocation in Russell Moore's article too. He calls it cultural Christianity. I'm sorry, but just call it evangelicalism. Like this does not represent the sort of cultural Christianity that you can find in other denominations, or like cultural Christianity is too broad a term. And
I do love that Methodists have this so we go to conference every year, and every year we write these letters to Congress, and I'm like, that'll be like anti-gun or all these sort of things, and I'm just imagining the person getting the letter going, oh, the Methodists think this, we should get right on that. I feel like there's like they have sent a sternly worded letter that's gonna change the nation.
And the evangelicals show up with fucking zip ties.
Zip ties and guns, and then all of a sudden they're running the country.
I think you're right, there is that.
And my last thing is the self-flagellation that Moore ends on. He says, I do know that when a man tells us he was in such a desperate, self-destructive place for so long, we owe it to him and to ourselves to ask, were we so deceived that we couldn't help him, or did we turn our attention away to the leader of a major evangelical institution with untold wealth and influence, as long as he was succeeding? If the latter, the problem isn't Jerry Falwell Jr.'s hypocrisy. The problem is us. I'm sorry, what?
Yeah,
It's called codependence.
Yeah, the listeners can hear my eyes rolling, I think. It's almost like Russell Moore had a great end. Like, the problem isn't Jerry Falwell, the problem is us. That's a great conclusion to an article. Now, how do I get there?
Yeah, right.
And it almost paints Jerry Falwell Jr. as this victim. And I can have empathy for the expectations and stuff that get placed onto someone whose dad is powerful or whose family. Even I'll speak to my own experience. When I was called to ministry, they were unspoken too. It wasn't even like my family put pressure on me. It might have just been perceived by me, but there is a pressure to act and behave in a certain way, and that maybe you don't want to. So I can have a certain amount of empathy for that in a vacuum. But you were a willing participant in all of this. You could have walked away. You were wealthy enough to walk away at any time. And you could have lived your life in the Blue Ridge Mountains and had your little throuple, and no one would have said anything.
And gone to Miami whenever you wanted.
Yeah. But you got off on the power. And so you're not a victim anymore. And this kind of goes to I think evangelicals, conservatives generally view any kind of accountability as
persecution
or unfair. Like, even Jerry Falwell Jr. is like, only went after me because I supported Trump. Like, I'm being persecuted, I'm being attacked, I'm being singled out. And no, you're just being held accountable for your actions. And in a just society, you shouldn't be the leader of a university. In a just society, you shouldn't be able to fine students. Your salary was paid for partially by students that were fined, I think, $250 for drinking, or maybe even being at a place that served alcohol, I think.
I just need you guys to know that I would have stood on his steps drinking and just had $250 ready to go.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding, guys. I don't have a problem, and also I'm not a rebel.
Yeah, and he would probably fine you and then bum a beer off of you.
I know.
Yeah. If you're in a just society, you don't get away with that and not have any accountability. And so it is just interesting. I feel like the whole evangelicalism generally just talks out of both sides of its mouth when it's like, we want accountability, we want law and order, we want all of that stuff. We want that for everybody else.
But the piece of accountability is apology.
Mm-hmm.
And I did not, and still have not, heard Jerry Falwell do anything other than, or Jerry Falwell Jr., throw people under the bus and say, it's not my fault. My dad was too nice to me, but it's not my fault. And there's no sense of any sort of apology. And I think that's the thing that makes me so angry with Mark Driscoll. There's lots of things. That's not the thing. That's one of the things that makes me really angry about all these people is there is no accountability that's taught within even evangelical spaces is usually involves apology and contrition. And this is not who I am. This is not. I want you to hear that this man openly said, this is who I am. And I told you who I was. That's like the opposite of an apology.
That's on you. And then people said, oh, yeah, that is on us. Like, come on.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to try to tie these couple different types of conversations we've had together, is this any sort of standard that you have experienced? Because I think that this story, even though it is about someone who was a business leader and not a pastoral figure, like the Vanity Fair article definitely highlights that his brother, who is the pastor, couldn't be reached for a comment or didn't want to comment. And this isn't really a religious story, even though it still is, because he still wielded religious power. Is this any? I think that my read on it as someone who's never had a position as a pastor or anything like that is that when you've accumulated a certain level of power or influence, you do escape that accountability on a sort of local pastoral level of someone that isn't tied into this. What is your read on how he is judged and how his moral character is perceived and discussed versus how another person, whether they're a pastor or a different type of religious leader, would have been judged and discussed at this level or in this type of discussion?
I think that the churches I've been in, and I've been in non-denominational churches, I've been in conservative denominations, I've served in United Methodist churches, almost across the board in the spaces I've been in. This isn't every church. This is just I feel like I have a large enough sample size to be able to make a certain amount of statement.
This is a peer-reviewed statement.
No. What's about to be peer-reviewed is that Christianity in the United States, or ministry in the United States, rewards results and will make excuses for results more so than character. There will be pastors of very large churches that it is just known that they are assholes. I know of pastors of large churches that are very kind publicly, but privately have thrown staff members against walls, have been physically violent, have said things and threatened things that I'm not going to go into super detail, but it's just like I know pastors have lied to me about finances before and lied openly to board members before, but they get results. And so accountability just is always out of reach unless it is a massive breach that's illegal or it is something that has to do with something that is, this is something Brad Onishi brought up in his podcast, Straight White American Jesus, or if it's something emasculating. Like that's why Jerry Falwell Jr., if he had been the one sleeping around, like that's a masculine sin. Whereas, oh, you were watching your wife and another guy, are you gay? Like, I think that kind of, that's an emasculating kind of sin. And so in their context, I don't have a judgment about it myself, but it's just in that context. So the type of sin will do it. But really, when it comes down to it, if you're pulling in money, you're pulling in numbers, you're not doing anything super illegal, you will escape a lot of accountability in many spaces. And that's unfortunate. And it drove me nuts. It's another reason why I left, but it's not the main reason. But it's just one reason where it's just like, I feel like this is just as unethical as and maybe more unethical as both the corporate spaces I've been in. I did not see the level of malfeasance that I've seen in some churches.
And maybe that is where the hypocrisy comes in, because I don't walk into a corporate space thinking that you're going to help craft me into a better human necessarily, unless it's an Apple store, and that's because I have a problem and I'm part of the cult. But when you walk into a religious institution, whether you are saying it or not, there is a certain assumption that you are going to help me be better at being me, and whatever that might look like, and that there's some authority around that. And I have been in spaces where very toxic behavior, that would never stand in a corporate setting, ever
you
stand.
get fired right away.
Right away. Is left to go on because they're a Christian or they're a Christian leader or whatever it might be. And so I think the sad part is it's not surprising. And I think, truthfully, I hate to admit that you're right, Justin. Had it been him having an affair, he would be easily welcomed back in. Because it's really hard, and probably we'd be hearing the story about the woman who tempted him away. And he had daddy issues, and then look at how stern his mom was. Of course he's going to have difficulty with relationships with women. It's
and
just
his wife was gaining weight.
Of course now, and she's got a exercise bike in the way. Just like all of this stuff, I think it's on a macro level that's happening on a micro level. I think we see this all the time. But I also think there is a little bit, again, the generous read that I had of it. We do ask people to sit on a pedestal, and then when they do, they act like people. And I think it's like, what voices are we actually listening to? I find it very fascinating. You don't often hear about, and it does happen, but not as much, female clergy who are inappropriate, all this sort of stuff. It's fascinating to me, or Black pastor or female pastors. It's just not the same. There's this really interesting what is it about these male dominant folks that we just keep making excuses for?
Yeah.
The problem isn't us, isn't them. It's us. I'm just kidding.
The problem is male pastors. The problem is us. Yeah, I think, Sarah, and I'm glad you said that, because when you said that, I was like, oh yeah, all the problematic pastors I know are white and male.
There are some problematic. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah, I'm sure there are, but it's just, and again, it's just part of the fact that most clergy are white and male in this country too. It could just be the sample that we're pulling from. But there is just a certain amount of, generosity in some ways. He gets results, and boys will be boys, and it's unfortunate. And I think the corporate world has, for the most part, obviously there's impropriety, but there's human resource departments. There are ways to appeal, whereas in church spaces, there is no safety net a lot of times. And if you get a reputation as someone who tattles on the senior pastor,
You're the problem, not the pastor.
you're the problem. You're going to be out of a job.
Yeah. I used to watch a lot of Simpsons, and there's this one episode where Bart does something bad and Milhouse tattles on him because the pastor was like threatening them with hellfire, basically. And he's like, Milhouse says, "It was Bart." And then he gets in trouble, and then the pastor comes back and grabs him and says, "You too, snitchy." And that's like very much how power is wielded in a lot of those spaces, but in a very small example there. Yeah. This has been a really fascinating
It's so fun to just chat about it, guys.
That's good.
Yeah. And to hear about this new project that you both have embarked on, as well as just talk through this sort of more topical thing and get your read on it as people who've had religious leadership roles. So thank you both for joining me. Where can people find your podcast, and where can they find anything else you're up to online?
Yeah, you can find our podcast with the Irreverent Media Group. You can actually just go to irreverent.fm and find our podcasts, or you can go on all of the podcast ways to find podcasts, some of which are currently lost favor, but you can find all kinds of different places you can find it. And it's Revcovery. It's, I think, instead of recovery, Revcovery. And then you can find us on social media at Revcovery Room. And the reason that we do that is that we are really hoping to build community around this. We're beginning with a podcast and hoping to end with community and cohorts and that kind of thing. You can find my work at RevSarahHeath.com. You can find me on all social media platforms as Rev Sarah Heath. If you find me on Twitter, congratulations, because I'm barely ever on there. But you two keep me up to date on all the things that happen on Twitter.
Yeah, all the show stuff that Sarah said is there and available. I also co-host another show on the Irreverent Media Group, Go Home Bible You're Drunk, where it's part drunk history, but it's Sunday school. And we have a good time with it. So you can check that out. I host that with Tori Williams Douglas. Also, I'm on the socials at Justin D. Gentry or Justin.Gentry. I'm on there somewhere. I got my socials at different phases of life, folks. I didn't get them all at once. And so the usernames are different. I apologize profusely.
Just keep it spicy.
Yeah, and you can find me online, justingentry.online. I'm actually in the process of rebuilding my website, so it may not be up right now, but it will be up shortly.
Great.
I will say I've got 2 other podcasts on our network. One that's been on hiatus and will be coming back called Making Spaces, which is this idea of how do we make space for ourselves and others, both literally and figuratively, because as well as being a pastor, I'm also a designer, which is weird, I know. And then the other one is Your Favorite Ants, which is literally the silliest yet most profound thing I do every week, which is where I gather with Kevin Garcia, another content creator within the Irreverent Media Group, and they and I sit around and we usually have a beverage or two. We talk about things that are happening in media, and then we give you advice that you may or may not want. And people join us live every week.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you both. Thank you both for joining me, and definitely check out both of their other projects as well. Thank you both.
Thanks.
Thank you.
1 Corinthians warned you about the women with a loud mouth, and this podcast is just that. Here at the Speaking in Church podcast, we talk all about the regular people and the things that regularly happen to them in the evangelical church. It's a podcast about change, it's a podcast about seeking moral high ground, and it's a podcast for people who are just trying to deconstruct on the safe side. You can listen wherever you get your podcast, and if you want to be a guest, yes, you, regular person, you can be a guest on the Speaking in Church podcast. If you want to come on, just let us know.